The Siege of Leningrad through rare historical photos, 1941 to 1944. The Siege of Leningrad, Part 1. Death descends upon the Neva. The surgical cut. Imagine September 1941, latitude 59.9 degrees north, longitude 30.3 degrees east. Over the Gulf of Finland, the air is not merely cold, it is dense, metallic, heavy with war. As summer fades in Berlin, 500 kilometers to the east, the Soviet autumn crashes down upon Russia with calculated violence. Leningrad, the majestic Petrograd of Peter the Great, the cradle of the Bolshevik Revolution, now stands in the crosshairs of cannons, a city of 3 million souls. Then comes the silence, that silence that precedes implosion. And then, a distant flash, a dull, resounding impact. It is the sound of the world on fire closing in on a city. The last railway line, the crucial MGA connection, has just been cut. It is 11 a.m., Moscow time. The Soviet Union's second-largest metropolis is no longer a city. It is a cauldron, a target, a kessel. The victor's plans. Meanwhile, in distant East Prussia, the Wehrmacht's headquarters radiates the arrogance of a victory they consider guaranteed. General-Major Franz Halger, chief of the Army General Staff, consults his maps with calculated satisfaction. Operation Barbarossa, launched on June 22, advances with an efficiency that bordered on the frightening. Kiev is about to fall. Moscow is the great prize. But Leningrad? For the German High Command, it is merely an appendix to be extirpated. Halder records in his diary what will be the official policy. The final objective for Leningrad is its hermetic encirclement. They will not engage in urban combat operations. They will let the Russian winter and famine do the work. It is more efficient. It is less costly for the Reich. Therefore, the strategy is simple, and in its simplicity, monstrous. Destruction by starvation. The Soviet human cost is irrelevant. Leningrad is not to be taken. It must be erased. The Nazi strategists, confident, consider the metropolis a biological time bomb. The lack of resources will be a more potent vector of death than any panzer unit. But within the besieged city, Stalin's orders ring differently. Brutal, non-negotiable, no surrender, no retreat. The resistance project, born under bombardment, is a mix of desperation and ideological conviction. It is not a military defense plan taken from a manual. It is a total mobilization. The men of the 8th and 23rd Fronts, weakened by the initial setbacks of Barbarossa, retreat in disorder. And the problems are immense. The defenses are tangled in primary technical failures. The city's garrison, originally prepared for a mobile defense, is short of armor and long-range artillery. Reports from the Stavka, the Soviet High Command, reveal the severity of the situation. A 40-kilometer gap in anti-aircraft coverage on the southern defense line. Fuel reserves for the Baltic Fleet barely exceed the critical margin of 14 days. Tactical coordination between the People's Militia and regular Red Army units is ineffective. And then there is the logistics. Leningrad is a continental island that received nearly 80% of its supplies via routes that are now cut. Flour reserves for civilians would barely last 30 days. The rushed and chaotic evacuation managed to move over 200 industries, but it left behind 2,800,000 civilians. What does not break? The Wehrmacht expected a rapid collapse. They expected hysteria. They expected surrender in 2 weeks at most. But Leningrad did not break. The few clandestine photographs from the time tell the story that propaganda cannot hide. old women, students, and workers digging trenches in flower beds. Thousands of women wielding shovels, building anti-tank barricades. The people's militia, poorly armed but fanatically determined, filling the gaps left by Red Army casualties. Lieutenant Colonel Erich von Monstein, commander of a panzer corps, records his perplexity. What they are facing are not soldiers. They are not soldiers. They are fanatics. Every house is a fortress. The tactical advance is stagnant. The Russian resistance does not follow military doctrine. They seem immune to the logic of annihilation.
Part 2. The Winter of the Apocalypse. Logistical collapse and the arithmetic of starvation. Leningrad's isolation was not gradual, it was a surgical cut. With the fall of MGA, the only remaining railway line, the city was immediately plunged into a state of terminal dependency. The German strategy, the hunger plan adapted to the siege, began to be executed with bureaucratic coldness. It was no longer dynamite, it was the arithmetic of starvation. On October 1, 1941, the Soviet authorities instituted rationing, a desperate but necessary measure. The rationing hierarchy reflects military priority with an arithmetic cruelty. Frontline workers and troops received the maximum, yet still insufficient quota of 500 to 600 grams of bread per day. Office workers and dependents received just 250 grams. Children and civilians not engaged in military production received only 125 grams. 125 grams. A slice that barely weighs the equivalent of a deck of cards. And this, bread, was a chemical miscellany. The wheat was gone. The bakeries, now artillery targets, worked with substitutes. 50 to 60% of the mass consisted of bran, cellulose, horse-feed oatmeal, and notoriously sawdust, technically hydrolyzed cellulose. It was war food. It was the engineering of desperation. Visual and sensory detail. The city froze ahead of schedule. By October, systematic Luftwaffe bombings had destroyed most of the food warehouses, including the vital Bardeyov depot. The destruction of electrical and gas networks coincided with the arrival of a particularly harsh Siberian winter. Temperatures plummeted to -30 degrees Celsius. Public transport stopped. The Neva froze. Urban life, as it was known, imploded. Starving and weakened people had to drag themselves for kilometers in the snow to reach the bread distribution kiosk. Many died on the way. Their bodies turned into statues of ice. The sight of corpses on the sidewalks became part of the daily landscape. Leningrad was no longer a metropolis. It was a museum of frozen death. Birth of a miracle, the road of life. But Leningrad still had a tenuous lifeline, a corridor over the cold, hostile waters of Lake Ladoga, a fragile and contested vital artery. In September, the Soviet Baltic Fleet and the Ladoga Flotilla organized an emergency supply effort by water, but the barges were unprotected. They were easy prey for German Stukas. Many essential cargoes sank into the icy depths. The true hope was born out of necessity in November 1941, when the surface of Ladoga finally yielded to the intense cold, solidifying. The Soviet defense then launched the most audacious and improbable plan of the entire war, to create an ice road. The project, coordinated by Red Army engineers under conditions of extreme risk, was not simply about putting trucks on the ice. It was science under the weight of death. Specialized engineers constantly monitored the ice thickness, calculating the maximum permissible load. The speed of the trucks was rigidly controlled, a maximum of 30 kilometers per hour, to prevent the creation of resonant waves that would break the surface. It was a mathematical dance over an abyss. The route, nicknamed Doroga Żyzni, the road of life, was under continuous attack from German and Finnish artillery and aviation. Anti-aircraft batteries were positioned on the banks and, when possible, on floating platforms or sleds. Men against machines, faith against destructive engineering. The road was not only for resupply, flour, ammunition, fuel, it was also crucial for evacuation, taking women, children, the elderly and the wounded out of the city, many in advanced stages of dystrophy. Skin-covered bones, eyes that no longer reflected the world. The road of life was less a logistical route and more an act of faith in Soviet physics and engineering. Success was marginal. The resources that arrived were just a trickle against the thirst of a metropolis. Many trucks, too heavy or hit by enemy artillery, sank into the ice, a cold testament to the price of every gram of food. Statistics of horror. The winter of 1941 to 1942 was the peak of the biological crisis. The German starvation policy was working with its cold, efficient cruelty. The mortality peak occurred in January and February 1942. It reached the grim mark of 100,000 deaths per month. 100,000. Every day, more than 3,000 people just ceased to exist. This mortality rate far exceeded the casualties caused by bombing. Approximately 97% of the civilian victims of the siege did not die from shrapnel. They died from starvation. The moral collapse. Under conditions of biological annihilation, the moral code collapses at its most extreme points. The phenomenon of cannibalism, although relatively rare compared to the magnitude of mass starvation, is documented in the archives of the NKVD, the Internal Security Agency. These previously censored reports revealed the depth of human despair when death by hunger becomes merely a matter of personal arithmetic. The first formal cases of human flesh consumption were recorded in December 1941. There were two categories of crime: trupojedztwo, corpse eaters, and in the rarer and more severe case, ludojedztwo, people eaters, murderers for food. By December 1942, the NKVD had arrested 2,105 individuals for related crimes. Corpse eaters often received prison sentences. People eaters, murderers for food, were summarily shot. Even madness has a hierarchy. But even more common, and in many ways a clearer indicator of social breakdown, was murder for rationing cards. The karta, the paper card, was the only asset of absolute value. Stealing it meant ensuring one's survival at the cost of another's death. In the first 6 months of 1942, Leningrad recorded 1,216 murders directly linked to card robberies. The line between survival and barbarism became thin. The city fought two enemies: the Wehrmacht beyond the walls and the relentless hunger within them.
Part 3. Cultural Resilience and the Indomitable Spirit. The Immovable Factory. War production in the fire zone. But even while starving, the Leningraders continued to manufacture weapons. This was not logic, it was defiance. Leningrad's strategic importance lay not only in its symbolic or port value, it was a vital center of military production. The Soviet Politburo demanded that production not cease even under saturation bombardment. Leningrad's factories, though emptied of many workers and raw materials, became the nucleus of operational resistance. Factories like Kirov, a manufacturer of tanks and heavy artillery, and Baltysky Zavod, shipbuilding, were converted into adapted production fortresses. Women, The elderly and adolescents as young as 12 took over the roles of men fighting at the front. Children who should have been at school now operated machines that weighed more than their lives. The technical challenge was overwhelming. With the interruption of external power supply, the workers, hungry and debilitated, were forced to generate power. They adapted steam generators and used firewood from parks and unoccupied buildings. The very wood of houses became fuel to power the war machines. Emergency ammunition became the priority. Production no longer focused on large projects, but on light weapons and essential ammunition. The Kirov factory could no longer assemble heavy KV tanks, but it could concentrate on repairing armor and manufacturing mortars. Every shell casing that left the production lines was a small victory against despair. Designers and engineers slept in the factories, developing improvised solutions for material shortages. They managed to patch up field artillery using scrap parts and invented heating and ventilation solutions for the underground production bunkers. Creativity was a weapon, too. A report from January 1942, at the height of exhaustion, summarizes the situation. Production had fallen 85% from pre-war levels, but the war effort remained above zero. Morale was intrinsically linked to the factory's ability to keep firing. The manufacture of 76mm high-explosive ammunition at Factory Number 196 was the single factor preventing the tactical collapse of the Leningrad front. Weapons are hope. Hope is survival. Scientific heroism. The Vavilov Institute of Plant Industry. The story of the Leningrad famine has its most poignant paradox in the Vavilov Institute of Plant Industry, one of the most important gene banks on the planet. Under the intellectual leadership of Nikolai Vavilov, though he himself was already imprisoned by Stalin elsewhere, his colleagues waged a silent war against the most basic instinct, food survival. In the Institute's basement, hundreds of thousands of samples of seeds, grains, tubers, and rare plants were stored and cataloged. It was the genetic heritage for the future of world agriculture. There were tons of rice, wheat, potato, and corn, an entire universe of sustenance. The sacrifice. At the peak of the winter of 1941-1942, when the bread ration amounted to sawdust and water, and death by dystrophy was the norm, a dozen scientists and guardians of the Vavilov Institute, surrounded by potential food, preferred death to violating the gene bank. They guarded the future. Dmitry Ivanov, a specialist on rice, died of starvation. Alexander Shukin, a potato specialist, died of dystrophy. Georgy Kreyer, a cereal specialist, collapsed in the laboratory. The scientists, thin, edematous, starved to the point of cognitive limit, died protecting the collection. They understood that the rare varieties they were protecting, including original wheat from Ethiopia and unique rice samples, were irreplaceable, more important than their individual lives, a cold, technical sacrifice in the name of post-war humanity. They died so that future generations could eat. The Seventh Symphony, Triumph of the Spirit. Resilience was not just physical or technical. It was metaphysical. It was music. The Soviet government, aware of the value of propaganda, planned an event that would prove to the world and to the Germans that Leningrad had not succumbed. The premiere of Dmitri Shostakovy's Seventh Symphony, Opus 60, nicknamed Leningrad. The work, written in part while the composer was acting as a volunteer firefighter in the city, was an 80-minute epic. Its performance in August 1942, amidst destruction and famine, required an act of cultural engineering. It was impossible, and so it was done. Conductor Karl Eliasberg had to reassemble the Leningrad Orchestra. The problem was severe. Most of the musicians were dead, sick, or evacuated. A rehearsal in March 1942 was aborted. Sarabian is dead. Petrov is sick. Borisov is dead. The orchestra is not functional, only fragments of an orchestra that was. Eliasberg sought reinforcements from frontline troops. Musician soldiers, malnourished, returned to the city to play. They had to be fed extra rations to have the strength to even lift their instruments. An oboist, Ksenia Matis, recalled that Eliasberg's hand, at the first rehearsal, looked like a wounded bird falling from the sky. The conductor's gestures lacked strength, only musical desperation. The performance, art and military strategy. On August 9, 1942, the premiere took place in the Grand Hall of the Philharmonic. It was an event that depended on artillery coordination. General Gavarov ordered a massive Soviet artillery counterattack, Operation Squall, aimed at the German positions, ensuring there would be no shelling during the symphony. The Philharmonic was the only point of silence on the front, a bubble of peace while the war continued around it. The music, amplified by loudspeakers and broadcast to the front lines and into Germany, achieved its objective. The long, insistent crescendo of the first movement, the invasion theme, caused the German soldiers on the front to pause. What was this? They expected horror. They received a symphony. A Wehrmacht soldier, in an enemy radio log, captured the confusion. We heard this music and we realized we would not be able to capture Leningrad. The people here are selfless. They are fighting for more than just territory. The message was clear. A city with the moral strength to assemble an orchestra and broadcast such an epic under such a siege would not be conquered by hunger. It was not possible. The music had transcended the geography of death. Leningrad's resilience, embedded in intact seeds and defiant musical notes, had raised the psychological and logistical cost of a German victory to an unbearable level.
Part 4. The Struggle for the Breakthrough. 1942. The Sinyavino Offensive. But the siege was far from over. After the horror of the first winter and the stabilization of the road of life, which, although vital, barely supplied basic needs, the Stavka, the Soviet High Command, considered it unacceptable to keep millions of people in the starvation extermination zone. The military objective for Leningrad in 1942 was clear: to break the blockade, to establish a permanent land connection with the rest of the USSR. The chosen area was the choke point south of Lake Ladoga in the swampy and densely forested region of Sinyavina and Emga. Swamps, forests, deep German defenses. The worst geography for an attack. The Sinyavino offensive, launched in August 1942, was a brutal test of attrition and inadequate tactical command. It involved the Leningrad front under General Govorov, attacking from the west, out of the outskirts of Leningrad, and the Volkov front under General Meretskov, attacking from the east. The target? The German fortifications stretching for about 16 kilometers, separating the two Soviet forces and the city from the rest of the USSR. But the Soviet tactical error was twofold and crucial. The Wehrmacht, under Field Marshal Erich von Manstein, was simultaneously planning Operation Nordlicht, or Northern Light, to take Leningrad. Heavy reinforcements, including the 11th Army, which had just conquered Sevastopol, had been relocated to the area. The Soviet attempts ran into a German force they did not expect to encounter. And the terrain was a killer. The Russian attacks became bogged down in the swamps and the dense German defenses along the Sinyavino heights. Coordination between the two Soviet fronts was disastrous. The Second Soviet Shock Army, exhausted by earlier fighting, suffered catastrophic casualties.
Men disappeared into the frozen swamps as if the earth were swallowing them. The Signavino offensive ended in mid-October 1942 with a tactical and strategic defeat. Soviet losses amounted to over 113,000 men, dead, wounded, or captured. The German line remained intact, a total and humiliating failure. The silver lining of defeat. Paradoxically, the slaughter had a positive secondary outcome for Leningrad. The German cost in the fighting was high enough to force the cancellation of Operation Nordlicht. The Wehrmacht, exhausted, had to maintain a defensive posture. Therefore, the Soviet defeat saved the city. Sometimes, history mocks the living. 1943, Operation Iskra. The spark ignites. The year 1943 began with the tide of the war turning in the south. The Soviet victory at Stalingrad had weakened the entire Eastern Front, requiring Hitler to withdraw vital units from other regions. In Leningrad, the Stavka saw an opportunity. The time was not for trying, but for breaking the siege once and for all. Operation Iskra, Spark, was conceived as a concentrated effort, utilizing the bitter experience of Signavino. It would be different. It would be calculated. The offensive was launched on January 12, 1943. The plan was straightforward but brutal. A double pincer. The Leningrad front, led by Govorov, would attack from the west, emerging from the outskirts of Schlisselburg. And the Volkhov front, led by Meretskov, would attack from the east. The target? The German fortifications stretching for about 16 kilometers, separating the two Soviet forces and the city from the rest of the USSR.
The Soviet war machine. The main tactic was massive firepower. A 2.5-hour artillery bombardment preceded the infantry attack. The concentration of fire on the German trenches at Schlisselburg was calculated for the total annihilation of the strongest resistance points. It was destructive arithmetic. It was the engineering of death. Armored shock units were designated for the junction, ensuring the connection was made quickly. The fighting was brutal. The German divisions had been entrenched for over a year in complex defenses with concrete bunkers and minefields, but the coordination and intensity of the Soviet attack were superior to anything seen in 1942. The Soviets learned with blood. The junction point, Schlisselburg. On January 18, 1943, 6 days after the start of Iskra, troops from the 372nd Rifle Division coming from the east and the 123rd Rifle Brigade coming from the west met near the settlement of Schlisselburg. The blockade, which had lasted 497 days, was technically broken. Leningrad was no longer an island in hell. There was a way back to the world. The new logistical reality. But the result of Iskra was not complete liberation. It was something more complex. The creation of a narrow land corridor, only 8 to 10 kilometers wide, running along the southern shore of Lake Ladoga. This corridor was Leningrad's new link to the Great Mainland. The immediate priority was the construction of the logistical infrastructure, an engineering race against time in the war zone. In record time, in less than 20 days, Soviet engineers built a single-track railway through the newly conquered zone, protected by snow barriers and artillery. The Polanya Magistral, the polar route, a symbol of determination. A pipeline and power cables were installed under Lake Ladoga and along the new railway line, restoring, to a limited extent, fuel and electricity supply. Life began to return, not full life, but life. The reality of the semi-siege. Leningrad was no longer besieged, but semi-besieged. The crucial problem persisted. The choke point was within range of German artillery. A report from Govorov, commander of the Leningrad front after Iskra, captures the bitterness of the partial victory. Although land communication was re-established, the city and the new supply line remained under saturation fire from 155mm and 203mm guns. The tactical priority was not advancement. It was the constant suppression of enemy artillery to keep the corridor operational. The threat of starvation was mitigated, but the threat of death by shell remained high. The siege continues. The spark had ignited hope, but Leningrad's hell continued to burn, just with a slower flow of casualties. The final liberation would require the total dismantling of the German siege machine, and that was yet to come. Time would pass in weeks, then months, then years. But now there was a difference. There was a corridor. There was bread. There was a future. Leningrad's resistance had transformed from a death cry into a war cry. Part 5. The final lifting and the legacy of extermination. The decisive moment. The narrow Eskara corridor, kept operational at an enormous logistical and human cost for a year, was insufficient. For the Soviet leadership, the German defeat at Stalingrad and the failure at Kursk in 1943 demanded a total movement. Leningrad would not just be resupplied, it would be liberated, irreversibly. The final liberation operation, the Leningrad-Novgorod Strategic Offensive, was launched on January 14, 1944. It was a colossal effort, coordinated by the Leningrad Front, the Volkhov Front, and the Second Baltic Front, supported by the air power of the Baltic Fleet. 3 fronts converging on a single objective: to drive out the invader. The hammer and anvil tactic. The attack utilized a massive pincer strategy. The Leningrad Front would attack from 2 critical bridgeheads: the small but firmly held Oranienbaum bridgehead on the Gulf of Finland and the positions to the south near the Pulkovo Heights. Simultaneously, the Volkhov Front would attack the southern flank at Novgorod to prevent the German Army Group North from transferring reserves to Leningrad. It was a pincer, 2 jaws closing on a prey that could not escape. The initial attack was an artillery barrage never before seen. General Govorov, a master of artillery, concentrated an overwhelming force of fire. The German positions, fortified and deep, yielded under the impact of the shells and the wake of the Soviet infantry, which now outnumbered the defenders by more than 2 to 1. The numbers were crushing, the destiny crystal clear. Regaining ground. In a rapid succession of victories, Soviet forces advanced, kilometer after kilometer, village after village. On January 20th, Novgorod was liberated. The ancient city, with its churches and millennia-old history, returned to the map of the Soviet world. On January 24th, the crucial Maga railway station was taken, re-establishing double-track railway communications. The umbilical cord between Leningrad and the rest of the country was no longer a thin, contested tube. It was a main artery.
The formal announcement. January 27, 1944. General Govorov formally announced the total lifting of the siege. After 872 days of agony, starvation, and fanatical resistance, Army Group North had been repelled to a safe distance of 60 to 100 kilometers. The total destruction of Leningrad, Hitler's genocidal dream, had been thwarted. The fortress of famine had not fallen, not by military force, but by the refusal to die.
Part 6. The Tragedy's Toll. The Price of Victory. The victory came at a cost that redefines the scale of human suffering in modern warfare. The technical data of the Siege of Leningrad place it as the deadliest in history. The civilian casualties. The most conservative estimates point to at least 650,000 civilian deaths from starvation, cold, and disease. Other Soviet sources raise this number to over 1,100,000. 1 million people. If counted one by one, it would take 27 years to name every victim, day after day, without rest. The Red Army suffered hundreds of thousands of casualties, killed, wounded, missing around the perimeter. The Leningrad-Novgorod offensive alone cost the Soviets about 314,000 casualties, men who did not return home. Historical comparison. A historical comparison puts the scale of the disaster into perspective. Historian Michael Walzer summarized it this way: "The siege killed more civilians than the bombings of Hamburg, Dresden, Hiroshima, and Nagasaki combined." It is not a comparison. It is the arithmetic of the apocalypse. Soviet casualties in the siege exceeded the total combined military casualties of the United States and Great Britain in all of World War II, the entire North Atlantic War, all the landings, all the campaigns. Leningrad alone surpassed all that in suffering. Analysis of extermination. But numbers are abstract. The reality is that the German objective was not tactical. It was demographic. The siege was an act of intentional and systematic extermination. Historians like Timothy Snyder and Nikita Lomagin classify the starvation policy in Leningrad as an act of genocide. Hitler's directive to accept no surrender and allow annihilation by famine makes the catastrophe not a byproduct of war, but its essence. Not an accident, a policy, a plan. The Siege of Leningrad was not a battle for territory. It was a racially motivated starvation policy against populations deemed inferior. It was war, but it was also something more. It was the practical test of an ideology of extermination, and Soviet humanity only failed to die according to plan.
Part 7. The Memorial and the Memory. The Reconstruction. The city was rebuilt, the rubble was cleared, the factories were restored. Leningrad received the honorary title of Hero City in 1945, an honored scar, a wound with a medal. But memory is etched into the landscape. It is in the bullet-scarred buildings. It is in the names of the dead who will never be known. It is in the deep silence that persists in the streets even as life returns. Piskaryovskaya. The place of greatest veneration and the most shocking testament to the tragedy is the Piskaryovskaya Memorial Cemetery. This vast, sacred field, inaugurated in 1960, does not contain individual headstones. There are no names, there are no faces. There is only a silent witness. 186 mass graves. It is estimated that over 470,000 victims of the siege, most of them anonymous civilians, are buried here. Men, women, children, people who died unknown, in darkness, without ceremony. At the center of the architectural composition, the eternal flame burns. It does not go out. It does not rest. In front of it, a colossal statue, the motherland. She carries a wreath of oak leaves, a symbol of mourning and resistance. A mother who cannot save her children, only weep for them. The last voice. Engraved on the granite stelae surrounding the memorial is a poem, the voice of Olga Bergholz, a poet who survived the siege, one of the few voices that remained conscious during the apocalypse, who documented, who remembered. Her words are the final and definitive voice of Leningrad. No one is forgotten, and nothing is forgotten. No one is forgotten, not the babies who died without ever having eaten, not the mothers who went mad with hunger, not the scientists who died protecting seeds, not the musicians who played a symphony while the city died, not the men who executed hunger criminals while they themselves were starving. And nothing is forgotten, not the mathematical engineering of the hunger plan, not the road of life sliding over the ice, not the factories that continued producing weapons even when there was no food, not the narrow corridor of Iskra, not the 872 days counted as years, as decades, as eternities. The meaning. The Siege of Leningrad remains not merely a military chapter of World War II. It is the definitive test of human capacity to endure extermination.
to resist not only with weapons, but with the refusal to accept death as inevitable. The remnants of German military engineering lie beneath the mud of the Eastern Front. The machines rust, the shells oxidize, iron returns to the earth. But the scar of Leningrad, visible in the rare photographs of frozen bodies in the streets, visible in the faces of the starving workers still working, remains indelible. It is proof that when the goal is total annihilation, the most potent resistance is not measured in tanks or planes or artillery. It is measured in the stubborn and desperate refusal to stop breathing. It is measured in a scientist's refusal to eat the seeds he protects, in a conductor's refusal to abandon his orchestra, in a factory's refusal to stop producing, in an entire city's refusal to die as planned. This is Leningrad, 872 days of iron, ice, and starvation. 872 days of proof that the human spirit cannot be starved to death, only to the point of refusing to die. And when the silence finally comes, when the eternal flame burns at Piskaryovskaya, and no one is forgotten because no one can be forgotten, we know that the true victory was not military. It was being alive at the end.